Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Brachos Daf Chafei. We're on Chav Daled Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, Hoisa talisoi chagur al masnav. If his cloak was girded to his waist, to his hips, meaning he was clothed from the hips on down, mutar likros krishma, he can recite krishma even though his upper portion, the upper half of his body, is still exposed. Tani Am Yachi, we learned a similar halacha in a brisa. Hoisa talisoi, his cloak made of beged, of cloth, v'shel oir, v'shel sak, made of leather or sackcloth. Chagur al masav is girded to his hips. Mutar likros krishma, he can recite krishma. Aval tefillah, however, for davening, for prayer, one is required, ashi chasas libo, he's required to have his heart covered. He's required to be properly attired, to present himself in awe and fear for the experience of tefillah, which is a act of direct communication with Hashem. So this is unique to tefillah, he must be properly attired. One who mistakenly enters a Beis HaKisei to relieve himself, and he realizes that he's wearing his tefillin. What is he meant to do? He places his hand on them until he completes relieving himself. Says he can wait that long? But rather until he completes the first discharge of waste of doilim, and then he goes and removes his tefillin. Says why doesn't he need to interrupt, to stop right there and get up? Says the Gemara, because it involves a physical danger. If a discharge is forced back, a discharge of solid waste is forced back, it is dangerous. Maybe it can bring a person an illness called hadroikin. This is urine meraglayim that is forced back. Maybe it's adam deyirakin. Therefore, a person must take care, must ensure that he doesn't force back his discharge, and therefore he's allowed to complete the first discharge and then go and remove his tefillin. Itma, we learned the following halacha. Soya al psori, if one has a bit of soya placed on his flesh somewhere in his body, or his hand, merely his hand is inserted into a Beis HaKisei. He's standing outside, but his hand is in a Beis HaKisei. What is his halacha? Rav Huna, he may recite Krishma in this manner. Rav Chizda also likros Krishma, he may not. Amar Rabba, my time to Rav Huna, what is the reason that Rav Huna allows him to recite Krishma? The neshama, the soul, should praise Hashem, and we darshan all the organs of the body which are involved in neshima, in breath, which is the nose, which is the mouth, they must be clean. However, if there's soya on a different part of the body, or for instance his hand, merely his yad, is inserted into Beis HaKisei, that is not a problem. That doesn't prevent him from praising Hashem, from reciting Krishma. Rav Chizda Amar also the Krishma. Why? My time, Rav Chizda. The Chsiv Kalat Smaisei Tamarna. Hashem Yechamecha. All my bones, my whole being will declare Hashem, who is like you. So apparently the whole entire person is involved in the experience of praising Hashem, and therefore, if there is a bit of tzoya anywhere on the guf, or if any part of the guf is inside of Beis HaKisei, that prevents him from reciting Krishma. Continues the Gemara, another machlekes between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. Itma, we learned. Reach rash yesh leikar. If there's a foul odor that originates in a tangible source, there's something tangible that is giving off this odor. Rav Huna Amar, marchik dal adamas v'kari Krishma. He distances himself 4 amas. He's marchik 4 amas from where? From the source, and he can recite Krishma. Rav Chizda Amar, marchik dal adamas v'mochel shapasika reach v'kari Krishma. He must be marchik 4 amas from where the odor dissipates. Meaning, we treat the odor as something unclean, and therefore he must be marchik 4 amas from the odor. So he's more stringent than Rav Huna. Tanik Rav Chizda, we learned a brayso that supports the view of Rav Chizda. The brayso says as follows: Lo yikra adam Krishma. Person should not recite Krishma. Lo yikneged tzoyis adam, opposite the tzoya of a person, of a human. Lo yikneged tzoyis klavim, of dogs. Lo yikneged tzoyis chazirim, of swine. Lo yikneged tzoyis harnegolim, of chickens. Lo yikneged ashba sharei chara, a foul-smelling dump, garbage dump. If if it was situated in a place which is 10 tefachim high, higher than this person, or 10 tefachim lower than this person, so it's considered to be in a separate domain, and he may sit there, Yeshav B'tzidei V'Kar Krishma, he can sit there and recite Krishma. Vimlav, but if he's on the same level as these unclean objects, Marchik Malay Einav, he must distance himself, Malay Einav, as far as the eye can see. The same halacha applies to davening. Continues the Brachos, Reach Rashi Yesh Le'ikar, and a awful odor, a bad smell that has a ikar, has something tangible that is giving off the smell. He must distance himself from the reach, V'Kar Krishma, and then recite Krishma. So this is the shita of Rav Chizda, that one must be marchik from the reach itself. Amar Rava, less hilchas hakamasnisa. The halacha does not follow the list of this brisa that listed a list of different types of ways, sayes adam, sayes klavim, sayes chazirim. We don't follow this halacha, ella, but rather ki hama the sanya, like the following brisa, which says le'yikra adam krishma, le'keneged sayes adam, not opposite the tzaya of a human. However, regarding the other tzayas, it depends. V'le'keneged sayes chazirim, v'le'keneged sayes klavim, only provided bizman shenasan oyros l'seicham. They were used for the process of processing the hides, the oyres. So when the oyres were put into these tzayas, into the tzayas chazirim or tzayas klavim, then the tzayah gets a very foul smell, and in that case, he must be marchik from them. But not ordinarily. A ordinary tzayas klavim or tzayas chazirim is not regarded in the same, does not have the same level as a tzayas adam, and one need not to distance himself from those. Continues the Gemara. They asked the question of Sheshas. What about the reich rashi ein leikar? There's a foul smell that does not have a tangible source. For instance, the air passed by a human. What is the halacha? Must one be marchik from that as well? Amar Lucy told him as follows: Asuchazu, come take a look. Hani tzipi debirav, the mats in the base medrash. The hani ganu. There are some students that are dozing, and inevitably when one is engaged in sleep, he passes air. V'hani garsi, and the other students are learning, even when there's a reich ra. So apparently it's not a concern. Concludes the Gemara, this is only regarding learning Torah, since it's inevitable that in the Beis HaMedrash there will be this odor, and therefore we don't require him to leave the Beis HaMedrash. However, Krishma, regarding reciting Krishma loy, in that case he has a solution. He can simply walk out for a minute, recite his Krishma, and come back in. And regarding the leniency applied to Torah, it's only Ela de Chavrei if the odor originated by Chavrei, by the other person. Aval Didei, if it's his own smell, if he was the one who passed the air, loy, he may not learn Torah when there is this foul smell. Itzma, we learned another halacha. Tzaya Iveris. If Tzaya is in transit, is not stationary but merely passing through, does it have the same status as stationary Tzaya or not? Abaya Omar Mutar Likritz Krishma. One may recite Krishma in its presence. It doesn't have the status of Tzaya. Rav Amar also Likritz Krishma. One may not recite Krishma. Amar Abaya Ben No, what is my source for differentiating between stationary Tzaya and mobile Tzaya? This nan, as we learned in the following Mishnah, regarding a Mitzora is Mitzamei. He passes on Tumah to anybody who is found together with him under the same roof in the oil. However, this is only provided that the Mitzora is standing there, he's stationary. Therefore, it's considered to be Moishava, his dwelling place. But if he's merely in transit, walking through, it is not considered to be Moishava, his dwelling place, and therefore, in that case, he's not Mitzamei, somebody who stands under the same roof as him. Says the Gemara again, this nan, as we learned in the Mishnah, if the Tamei, the Mitzora, is stationary, standing in one place under the tree, and the other fellow, the Torah, is walking through, passing through, Tamei, he becomes Tamei. He gets Tamei because the Mitzora is standing under the tree, therefore, thereby making this tree as the dwelling place of the Mitzora, and it is Mitamei, the Torah, who passes there. However, in the reverse, if the Torah is standing there, and the Tamei is merely passing through, in that case, the Tamei doesn't pass over Tumah to the Torah, since the Tamei is merely passing through, so it's not considered to be his domain. But if he's decided to stand, to stop, and now it's considered to be his dwelling place, so he is Tamei, meaning the Torah contracts Tumah from the Mitzora, since this is the Moshe of the dwelling place of the Mitzora. Says the Mishnah, V'chein be'evan ha'menagas, the same halacha will apply to an evan ha'menagas, to a stone from my house that had a nega. It is also matame be'oil, and the same halachas will apply. Says the Gemara, apparently we see there's a difference between being stationary and in transit. Says Abaye here too regarding tzoya. The tzoya will only interfere with the person if the tzoya is standing there. We require a person's camp, a person's place should be kaddish, should be clean, should be pure, should be holy, without any presence of tzoya. But if the tzoya is merely passing through, it's not considered that the tzoya is present there, is stationed there, and therefore it is still considered to be that the person's machna, his encampment, is still kaddish. Vrav amalach, no, there's a distinction between the two things. We can separate between the two topics. Hasam by Matzera, b'kviyus talimisa. The determinant factor, what does it depend on? Being established, stationary. It is considered to be his dwelling place. The chsiv, as it says in the pasuk, regarding Matzera, Bada Yeshev, he should sit in isolation, Mechutz LaMachna Mishavi, outside of the Machna Yisrael, should be his dwelling place. So we think that a Matzera has a dwelling place, and therefore it is only if he's stationary. But Hacha by us regarding Tzoya, the pasuk simply says, "V'hoya machanecha kadosh." Your camp should be holy. Amar Rachmana, Torah says, "V'holeka," and it isn't, since there's tzoya present in your machna, regardless of whether it's standing or moving. Your machna is not kadosh, and therefore you may not recite Krishma in this location. Continues the Gemara. Amar Papa, Pi Chazir, the mouth of a chazir of a swine, Kitzoya Iveres Dami, is presumed to contain tzoya on account of its constant rummaging through the trash, and it has a halacha of tzoya, Iveres, moving tzoya, which is dependent on the machlekes mentioned earlier. So in our pshita, it's obvious, certainly, we can rightfully assume that there's tzoya present there. Like Tzricha is coming to teach us, Avagav the Salak Manahara. He is just about, he's emerging from having rinsed himself in the river. Nevertheless, we assume that he hasn't cleaned himself properly and there's still some tzoya remaining there. Amar Yehuda, Safek tzoya. If a person has an uncertainty regarding the presence of tzoya, asura, he must be stringent and not recite Krishma in that location. Safek meraglayim mutar, regarding urine meraglayim, he can be lenient. Ikadami, there's another version of Amar Yehuda, Safek tzoya bebayis muteris. In a home where it is not common to find tzoya lying around, so even regarding uncertainty regarding tzoya, he can be lenient. You can assume it's not there. But ashpa, however, in the trash, asura, he must be stringent and assume that perhaps there is tzoya there and he must refrain from krishma. Safek meraglayim, regarding urine, afilu ba'ashpa nami miturn, he may be lenient even regarding a trash. If he checks through the ashpa and he sees no tzoya, he doesn't have to be concerned perhaps that there is meraglayim present there. Why? Why are we more lenient regarding meraglayim than tzoya? Explains the Gemara, Saval Kihoder Rav Nuna. He follows the shita of Rav Nuna. The Amar Rav Nuna, the Torah only forbade Ela Keneged, the Amud Bilvad, only opposite the Amud, the stream, the flow coming out of meraglayim, that is considered to be a problem regarding Krishma. Ukj Rav Yonasan, similar to the words of Rav Yonasan. Rav Yonasan had a contradiction. He has to steer between two psukim. Ksiv, on one hand it says, you should have a place outside of the camp, where you will go out and relieve yourself. It doesn't mention anything regarding covering up your waist. And then the other pasuk says, you should have a you should have a sort of a peg, a tool that you will use, that you will cover your waist. So does one need to cover or not? How are we going to resolve this contradiction? It depends. That regarding solid waste, one must cover it up in order to recite Krishma nearby. However, regarding Ktanim, regarding Meraglayim, there's no such requirement. Alma, so we imply from here, apparently, Ktanim Lasar Torah, Elo Keneged Amud Bilvad. Once the Meraglayim reaches the ground, the Torah does not forbid. Torah only forbids Keneged Amud, opposite this stream. Therefore, when one relieves himself of Meraglayim, he's not required to cover it over since it is already on the ground. Ha nafal arashari, once he reaches the ground, it is mutar min haTorah. However, Rabbanan made a gzera, they decreed to forbid even meraglayim that is already positioned on the ara on the floor. However, Rabbanan only applied the gzera if it's a case of certainty. He's sure that there's meraglayim there. However, if he has a doubt, he's uncertain regarding the possible presence of meraglayim, the Rabbanan did not apply the gzera, and it is permitted. So, in conclusion, we have a summary of several halachas. Number one, regarding tsoya, which is on a portion of a person's guf, or if a portion of a person's body is inserted into Beis HaKisei. May you recite Krishma? According to Rav Huna, yes. According to Rav Chizda, no. The next halacha was regarding how far does one have to distance himself from a reach ra, from a foul odor that has a tangible source. According to Rav Huna, he needs to distance himself marchik from the object, not from the reach. According to Rav Chizda, he needs to be marchik from the reach. We learned halacha regarding reach ra she'ein le'ikar. A reach does not have a tangible source. Rav Sheshes taught us that one is allowed to engage in Torah study even in the presence of such a odor, provided that it originated by somebody else. And regarding tsoya iveris, tsoya which is merely in transit passing through, Abaye said it is mutter, Rava said it's asur. And finally, regarding a suffix and uncertainty, Rav Yehuda told us the difference between tsoya and meraglayim. Tsoya, he needs to be machmer, it's asur. Some say this is only by ashpa. Regarding meraglayim, he can be lenient, and he doesn't have to be worried about the presence of meraglayim. Continues the Gemara, Uvavadon ad kama. When one has meraglayim, until what point does it have the status of meraglayim? How dry must it become in order to lose its status, its legal status of meraglayim? Says the Gemara, Omar Vida Mashmol calls man shemat fichin, as long as it's still damp enough that it will moisten something which comes into contact with it. V'chein Omar Rabba Rachan Rav Yochanan calls man shemat fichin. V'chein Omar Ula calls man shemat fichin. However, Gniva, in the name of Rav, said, Gniva Mishmeid Rav Amar, a more stringent view. Even if it's not damp, that it would moisten something which comes into contact with it. However, since the trace, the rishuman, the trace of the meraglayim is still visible, it is still considered to be legally in the status of meraglayim. Rav Yosef challenged him. Surely Mar Gniva, the master, Hashem, should forgive Gniva for falsifying the shita, the opinion of Rav. It can't be that Rav holds such a stringent view. Because hashta tsoya, because since regarding tsoya, which is generally more stringent, we find that Rav was very lenient. Amar Vidam Rav, kivan shekarnu paneh mutar. As soon as the surface crusted over, it became somewhat dry. It loses its status of tsoya. Meraglayim iboye. Certainly regarding meraglayim, Rav would follow the lenient approach and would not require that the trace should disappear. As long as it already dried up somewhat, it is sufficient. Only Abaye. So Abaye responds to Rav Yosef, "My chazas is samchasaha. Why are you following this quote of Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav regarding tsoya, and he adopts a lenient view? Smaichaha, follow the other quotation in the name of Rav. The Amar Rav Huna Rav tsoya fil ki cheres asur. Tsoya which is dry, even like a piece of cheres, like earthenware, is still asur. It's still considered to be tsoya. Therefore, it is not surprising that Rav adopts a more stringent approach regarding meraglayim as well, and it requires it to be ein rishum anikor, that the trace needs to entirely disappear. It says, well, what does it mean tzoy kecheres? Ve'echi domi tzoy kecheres. Amar Rabba Rachan Rav Yochanan kol zman shezor kebein nefreches. When he throws it, if it doesn't crumble, it's not considered to be completely dry, and it still has the status of tzoya. V'ikadamid, there's another version. Kol zman shegoyel kebein nefreches. When you roll it and it doesn't crumble, that is considered to be tzoya. This is a more stringent view. Meaning, even if you would throw it, it would crumble. But nevertheless, since when you merely roll it, it doesn't crumble, it's still considered to be tsoya. Amar Ravina, Havakiimna Kamid Rav Yehuda Midifti. I was standing in front of Rav Yehuda Midifti. Chazasai, he noticed some tsoya. Amarli, he told me, Ayin, take a look, go see, Ikarmu Panei Eloi. See if it crusted over or not. Ikadamri, another version, Hachi Amarli. Ayin, take a look, Imafli, if it began getting cracks. And the Mefarshim explained this is the same level as goylel vein nefreches. If you would roll it, it wouldn't crack. So we have various opinions regarding the dryness, the level of dryness that tzoya needs to get to lose its status of tzoya. My havila, what is the conclusion? Itzmar, we learned tzoya kecheres, a tzoya that is dry as cheres, amema ama asura, mazusha ama muteres. Ama rabba hilchas tzoya kecheres asura, meraglayim kozman shmat fichem. So you adopted a very stringent view regarding tzoya. Even tzoya kecheres is asur. However, regarding meraglayim, he was more lenient. It is merely until it loses its moisture. It's only up until, as long as it's still damp enough to moisten something which comes into contact with it. Meisive, we have a brayso which seems to indicate otherwise. As long as it's moist, it's asur. Nivlu, if it got absorbed, the yavshu dried up, Rashi says on a rock, so dried up mutar, then it is mutar. Mailav, perhaps you would say, nivlu dum yavshu, that the two cases mentioned in the brayso, being absorbed and being dried up, are similar. Ma yavshu deinu shumanika, when it dries on a rock, it doesn't leave a trace. Af nivlu, so too the halacha of being absorbed, it is provided deinu shumanika, that the trace is not seen anymore. Ha rishumanika, we can apply from here that if the trace is still visible, asur, it still has the status of meraglayim. Afagav de matfichen, even though it's not moist anymore. So you have a right from this brayso that the shiur meraglayim, it depends on trace and not on moisture. Says more according to your approach. Let's take a look at the reisha. Take a look at the beginning of the brayso. The brayso says kol zman shmatfichen, as long as it's still moist. We can infer from there kol zman shmatfichen asur. Ha rishumanika shari. It needs to be moist, but if it's merely the trace is visible, it is mutar. So we have a opposing diyukim. From one part of the brayso, it seems that the determining factor is the trace. From the other part of the brayso, we see that the determining factor is the moisture. We can't have any diyuk from this brayso because they are contradictory. Perhaps this depends on a machlekes tanoim. What is the shiur of meraglayim? The brayso says as follows: a vessel which was designated to contain urine, meraglayim, and now was emptied. Also, likras krishma kenegla. You may not recite krishma opposite this kli, even though it's free from meraglayim. Nevertheless, since the kli itself was heavily used, was designated for meraglayim, and itself is considered an object, an unclean object, and you may not recite krishma kenegla. Continues the brayso. Meraglayim atzbachan shenishpachu. What about the meraglayim themselves that spilled out? It depends. Nivlu mutar. If they got absorbed, it is fine. If they're not absorbed, it is asur. Rabbi Yosi Omer calls them ashmatfichen, as long as it's still moist. Now the Gemara will analyze the machlokes between the Tanakam and Rabbi Yosi. What is their point of contention? My nivlu, the comment Tanakam. What exactly did Tanakam refer to when he said it depends if it was absorbed or not? Nivlu means it got absorbed to the point that it's not moist anymore. It does not moisten something which comes into contact with it. So that is considered to be mutar. Loi nivlu, when the brayso says that it wasn't absorbed, it is still asur. It is referring to matfichen, was still moist. But asur v'yesi l'meimar, v'yesi comes to disagree, and he says, you know what? As long as it's moist, it's asur. Harishuma nikar shari. If it is already absorbed, but you merely see the trace, it is mutar. So this is the exact same sheet as Tanakama. Hainu Tanakama. With what are they arguing about? Ella, rather, you must interpret the brayso differently. When the brayso says nivlu, he doesn't mean absorbed. He's not speaking about moisture. Ella nivlu de'in rishuma nikar. The Tanakama says it depends if the trace is visible. So if it became nivla to the point that the trace is not visible anymore, then it's mutar. Loi nivlu, if it wasn't absorbed to that point and is rishuma nikar, then it's asur. So Tanakama presents the determinant factor as being the trace, whether the trace is or not visible. Well, Rabbi Yosi comes to disagree and he says, no, it doesn't depend on Rishon. Rabbi Yosi says it depends on moisture. So we have a machlekes tanoim. What does meraglayim depend on? According to Tanakam, it depends on the Rishon, the moisture, the visibility, the trace. According to Rabbi Yosi, it depends on the moisture. Says the kuli alma calls asur. Everybody agrees it depends on moisture. If it is absorbed to the point that it's not moist anymore, but merely the trace is visible, certainly it loses the status of meraglayim. So what then is the machlekes? The discussion is whether we require a high level of moisture, a level of moisture that would moisten something which comes into contact with it to the point that it can carry over the moisture to something else. It is teifeach amanas latfiach. It is very moist. So according to Tanakama, yes, that is required. And if it is not wet enough to that degree, it is mutar. According to Rav Yosi, we don't require that much. If it is merely moist enough that it would moisten something, the first thing that comes into contact with it, even if it can't carry the moisture further, nevertheless, it has a status of meraglayim and is asur. So in conclusion, we have many different levels of dryness regarding tzoya, regarding meraglayim. We have basically 3 levels regarding tzoya and 3 levels regarding meraglayim. Regarding tzoya, we have the most lenient level, which is karma panel. As soon as it gets a bit crusted, is already dry, is not considered to be tzoya. We have the middle level, which is zerkin and freches. If it crumbles when you throw it, that is already considered to be dry enough. And we have the most stringent shita, which holds that we require goylul of freches. It needs to be rolled and crumble when it rolls. That is the most stringent shita. Regarding meraglayim, we have 3 shitas. Whether it depends on tefeach amlasat tefeach, it needs to be very moist. Whether it merely requires to be tefeach, and finally, whether it depends on its trace being visible. That is the most stringent shita. Continues the Gemara, Yorat Lidvel, one who went to be toivel, im yochel lalis, if he has enough time available to come out of the mikveh and recite his krishma prior to Netzachama, he should do so. Says the Gemara, Lema, Tanan Stoma, Kir Reb Lezer. Apparently this Mishnah, which discusses reciting krishma prior to Netzachama, apparently it's found in the Shita of Reb Lezer, who holds the Amar Ad Netzachama, that one must recite krishma prior to the beginning of sunrise. That is the deadline. Says the Gemara, even if the Mishnah is following the view of Rabbi Shua, which allows one to recite krishma up until 3 hours, perhaps this Mishnah is speaking about a person who is a Vasikin, he is a devout fellow, who is conducting himself in the manner of the Vasikin, the Amar of Yechanan. Vasikin, the devout people, they would recite krishma, they would complete their krishma prior, in close proximity to the beginning of sunrise, and therefore this person who wants to conduct himself in this manner, to recite krishma prior to Netzachama, the Mishnah is referring to this type of person, but this is not something which applies to the general public. It is not obligatory on everybody. Certainly, the general public can follow the Shita of Rabbi Shua and recite krishma up until 3 hours. Says in Ravim Lav, if he doesn't have enough time to come out and recite krishma, Yiskasa b'mayim v'yikar, should cover himself merely with the water and recite krishma. Says the Gemara, how can he do so? His heart is exposed to his erva. Rashi explains that any limb, any ava of the person which isn't generally exposed to the erva cannot be exposed during krishma. So what about his heart? How could he be standing in the water undressed? His heart is exposed to his erva. We're speaking about muddied water, the damer karasmichta. They are considered like thick earth, meaning just like if one is inside the ground, the earth which is pressed against his heart is considered to be a covering on his heart, and it's not considered to be that his heart is exposed to his erva. Here too, the water which is muddied is considered to be covering his heart, and there's no concern. So that his heart doesn't see his erva. If they are clear water, he can be in the water up until his neck. Make sure that the water rises up to the point of his neck, and being that his head, that his eyes are outside the water, now he may recite krishma v'kari. He can recite krishma since the eyes are not seeing the erva. Why are they not seeing the erva? Since they are in a different domain. His erva is below the water and his eyes are outside the water. They're considered to be in a separate domain, and there's no concern of einav royas erva. Some say he must muddy the water with his legs. He must kick up the dirt to muddy them, and in this way he is also covering up his heart. So apparently the Tanakama is not concerned with his heart. The Tanakama holds even in clear water he can recite krishma. Says the Tanakama, what about the concern of his heart seeing the erva? Why does he not require that the water should be muddied and in that way cover up his heart as well? Because Savar, apparently Tanakama holds that is not a concern. Says the what about his heel which is exposed to his erva? Because Savar that too is not a concern. Itman we learned. If one's heel is exposed to his erva, mutter, that is not a concern. That is mutter. He's allowed to recite krishma in this manner. What about negeya? What about if his ache of his heel is actually touching the aver of the erva? Abayam asr, it is prohibited to recite krishma in this manner. V'rabba abba mutter, it is allowed. Rav Zvid masna lashmai tahachi. Rav Zvid had the previous version of this halacha. However, Rav China be'Ravika masna lahachi had a different version. Negeya, if his heel is actually touching his erva divar kolas, everybody agrees that it is asr to recite krishma. Tais explains that the reason for this isser is we are concerned regarding his hands touching his erva, which provokes machshavas, evil, inappropriate thoughts, which is prohibited during Krishma, certainly during Krishma. So therefore the Chachamim prohibited any aver to touch the erva on account of his hands. So therefore the Gemara says regarding Negeya, regarding the heel touching his erva, everybody agrees that this is asur during Krishma. However, Roya, if it's merely seeing, it's exposed to the erva, we have Achlekes, Abaya Ma'asur, Rava Amamutter. Why does Rava say it's mutter? Lo nitna Torah l'malchasher. Torah wasn't given to angels. We're human beings. Since we have an erva, it's virtually impossible to be careful, to be vigilant about an aver coming to touch with the erva. The conclusion is noigei asur. If it is contacting, if it's actually touching the erva, it is asur. Roya mutter. If it's merely seeing the erva, one may recite Krishma in this manner. Continues the Gemara. Amar Rava. Soya b'ashashis. If a tzaya, a piece of waste, is in a lantern, meaning it is covered up with a transparent covering, mutar likros krishma kenegda. You may recite Krishma opposite this tzaya since it's covered. However, erva b'ashashis, if a erva, the organ of a person, which is the erva, is covered up with a transparent covering, also likros krishma kenegda. One may not recite Krishma opposite this erva since he can see it. What's the difference, says the Gemara? Tzoya b'ashashas mutar likros krishma kenegda. Why? That tzoya bekisi tol rachmana. Bekisi tol musa. It is dependent upon being covered. Since the Torah says bekisi sesecha, as was mentioned earlier, once it's covered, even if the cover is transparent, it's okay. It's covered. However, erva b'ashashas asa likros krishma kenegda. Why? Because the pasuk says regarding erva, v'lo yera b'chayavas davar amar rachmana. The Torah says you may not see an erva. And since it is visible through the covering, through the transparent kisoi, it is asur. Amar Abai, tzoya culture, if there's a bit of tzoya, mevatl b'roik, you can nullify it by spitting on it. Amar Rava b'roik ava, it needs to be thick saliva, thick roik. Now the question is, why does it need thick roik? Why isn't a bit of roik sufficient, although it's transparent? We just said that if one covers up tzoya with a transparent covering, it's sufficient. Farshim say, since roik is also a liquid, so a bit of a liquid and it's transparent, so we have two chesroinos here, two disadvantages. Therefore, we need roik of a thick roik. Continues the Gemara. Amar Rabba. Tzoya beguma, if there is tzoya in a pit, maniach sandola lev kari Krishma. He merely places a sandal on it and he can recite Krishma. He can cover it by means of his shoe. Mar Breder Ravina. Mar Breder Ravina asked the following question: Soya dvuka b'sandal. If it is actually attached to a sandal, is that okay? Might take it. We leave it unresolved. So there's a difference between just merely covering over the tzoya and where the tzoya is actually glued. It is stuck to his foot, to his shoe. Amar Rav Akum Aram, a guy who is undressed, also likros Krishma kenegdai. One may not recite Krishma opposite his erva. Says the Gemara, Yakim, why do you need to stress the halacha regarding a guy? I feel Yisrael Nami, even Yisrael has the prohibition of one may not recite Krishma opposite his erva. Says the Gemara, Yisrael pshitali dasa. Certainly, it is obvious that Yisrael has this halacha. Elo akim etzricha. You need to inform us the halacha regarding a guy as well. Perhaps I would think one can differentiate between the two. Ma'ul perhaps I would say, Hoyel v'ksivu asher b'sar chayrim b'sarim. It is like flesh of donkeys. Is the flesh of a goy? It isn't significant. It's like the flesh of a donkey and has no status of erva kamash malon. He informs us, yes, inonami ikur erva. They too are regarded as erva. The chsiv, as the pasuk says regarding Noach, who was before Matan Torah. They did not see, did not gaze at the erva of the father. So apparently, even a goy, goy's erva has the status of an erva, and one may not recite Krishma opposite the erva. So in summary, we learned several halachas. A person's eyes, the inayim, may not be royas erva, may not be exposed to his erva, therefore they need to be outside of the water. Regarding liboy, his heart, we have a machlekes of whether or not leiv can be royas erva. The same thing regarding other limbs in the person's body, may they be exposed to the erva or not, there's machlekes. And a machlekes also regarding an aver of a person coming into contact with his erva. Is Krishma allowed to be recited in that manner or not? The Gemara continued to give us the distinction, the difference between erva and tzoya. Regarding tzoya, a mere covering is sufficient, even if it's transparent. An erva requires an opaque covering. Regarding a tzaya which is in a pit, he may cover it with his sandal, with his shoe. However, if the tzaya is glued, is davak, is attached to a sandal, the Gemara left that unresolved. The Gemara concluded to teach us that an erva of a goy also assumes the legal status of an erva. Continues the Gemara. One may not cover himself with foul-smelling waters until he pours water into them. Says the Gemara, how much water could he pour into this? We're speaking about a very large amount of me'am mishra, of water that was used to soak the flax. You can't suggest that a person should go ahead and pour much water until he nullifies, until he removes the bad odor. So it can't be that the Mishnah is referring to the me'am mishra. Ella, but rather, this is what the Mishnah is telling us. He shouldn't cover himself with foul-smelling waters at all. However, regarding urine meraglayim, he may not do so. He may not recite Krishma in close proximity to the meraglayim until he pours water into it and he nullifies the meraglayim. And then he can recite Krishma. So the halacha of Ashiyatal Soich Mayim is referring to meraglayim. So how much water does he need to spill into meraglayim? We have machlokes on Rabbanan. Kama yatal Soich Mayim. How much? Kol shu, even a bit. Rav Zakkai revius, he needs a revius. Over Rav Nachman machlokes, the disagreement between Tanakama and Rav Zakkai is regarding V'lasoif. When the meraglayim was already present and he's coming to nullify the meraglayim, he's coming to pour water afterwards. Tanakama holds it is enough to have a kol shu. Rav Zakkai says one is required to have a revius. But if the clean water was there first, was in the kli first, prior to the arrival of the meraglayim, in that case, since the meraglayim drips into the clean water, it becomes batal. Each drop that drips in there becomes batal into the clean water, and therefore even kol shein, even if there's only a bit of clean water there, that is sufficient to be mevatel the meraglayim that comes later. Ava b'tchil kol shein, if the clean water is there first, even a bit is sufficient. Everybody will agree, even Rav Zakkai. Rav Yosef Amar no. The machlokes is l'chatchila, is concerning a case where the clean water was there first. So according to Tanakama, even a kol shu is enough. According to Rav Zakkai, he requires a revius. Aval b'asoif, but if meraglayim came first, and then he's coming to nullify with clean water, everybody adopts the most stringent share of a revius. Only Rav Yosef l'shami, Rav Yosef instructed his servant, "Aisi l'revius of the Ma'ik Rav Zakkai. Bring me a revius of water in accordance with the stringent sheet of Rav Zakkai." And evidently he was referring to Betchila, when he was coming to put the water first. Nevertheless, he adopted the stringent view of Rav Zakkai that one is required to have a sheer revius, even if the clean water comes first. Now the poskim speak out that the sheer revius can be applied to one dose of meraglayim, the amount of meraglayim that one relieves himself in one shot. But if there is another portion of meraglayim, one is required to have more clean water. So the sheer revius is regarding one sheer of meraglayim. Continues the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brachos. Grav sharei, a vessel, a kli which was designated for tzaya. V'avish meraglayim, a vessel which was designated for meraglayim. And Rashi says it's speaking about a cheres, which is very absorbent. So in this case, also likris krishma kenegdon, one may not recite krishma opposite these vessels, even if they were cleaned out, since they were highly absorbent. So the kli itself assumes the status of an unclean object. However, meraglayim atzman ashiyatal seichamayim, meraglayim themselves are permitted if he pours water into them. How much does he need to pour into them? Kol shu, the same machlokes as we mentioned earlier. Continues the Brachos. Where is this meraglayim situated? Says the Tanakama, bein lefnei mita, bein la'achar mita. It is irrelevant whether the meraglayim is between him and the mita. There's nothing interrupting, or whether the meraglayim is behind the mita and the mita is coming in between him and the meraglayim. He must be marchik from the meraglayim. No, it depends. If the meraglayim is behind the mita, he can recite Krishma. If the meraglayim is on this side of the bed, he cannot recite, unless he distances himself 4 amas from the meraglayim. We have a third shita. Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, I feel bayis mei amma. Even if the house is so large, it is mei amma big. Lo yikra ad sheyitzim or sheyanichem tachas hamita. One may not recite Krishma even if he's marchik for amas until he removes the meraglayim completely or places them under a bed. They become enveloped in the bed. Why? The reason is because Rav Shimon Elazar holds that a house, since it is an enclosed area, it has the status of one domain. What is the point of being marchik for amas? What is the point of distancing oneself 4 amas from something which is unclean? The reason is because 4 amas is considered to be an area on its own, a domain. So when one leaves that domain, he leaves the 4 amas, which contains this unclean item, he's going to a different domain. However, says Rav Shimon Elazar, a bayis is considered to be one solitary domain. So whether he is close to the meraglayim or he's far away from the meraglayim, it's irrelevant. He's still in the area, in the domain of the meraglayim. So you have 3 shitas here. Continues the Gemara. Ibaylahu. The Gemara wants to analyze the Brisa. Heichi ka'amar Rav Shimon Gamliel. What does Rav Shimon Gamliel mean? Achar mita kar miyad. Rav Shimon Gamliel makes a differentiation. He distinguishes between when the meraglayim is on the other side, on the far side of the bed, or if it's on this side of the bed. How do we interpret his view? Achar mita kar miyad. If the meraglayim is on the other side of the bed, he can recite Shema immediately. He doesn't need to be marchik at all. However, if it's on this side of the bed, he needs to distance himself 4 amas. Or perhaps, this is what he meant to say. If it's on the far side of the bed, he needs to be marchik 4 amas. But if it's on this side of the bed, he may not recite Krishma at all, even if he's marchik. So which way did he mean? Tashma, come on here. The Sanya, Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, if the meraglayim is on the far side of the bed, he can recite immediately without being marchik. If it's on this side, marchik 4 amas, he needs to distance himself 4 amas. Even if the home is so large, he cannot recite until he removes the meraglayim completely or puts them under the bed. So we see that we have these same 2 shitas as mentioned in the first brisa, although the names were switched around. However, these 2 views appear to correspond. They represent those same shitas mentioned earlier. And if we see that here, the brisa frames it in this manner, that there's a difference between whether the meraglayim is on this side or the bed on that side. And if it's on the other side, he may be kar miyad. If it's on this side, it needs to be marchik dal damis. So apparently that is the shita of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in the first brisa, that differentiates between whether the meraglayim is on this side or the other side. That the halacha is that if it's on the other side, he may recite immediately without harchaka. If it's on this side, he needs dal damis. Says Umar, okay, bayin of shitalan. We've concluded, we've clarified our question. However, masnaisa kashna adadi. What's going to be with the names? The brisa seems to contradict each other. In one brisa we have the views stated connected to certain names, and the second brisa we switch them around. Says more ifich bas brisa. Let's just switch around the second brisa, which will correspond, which will be in line. If we switch around the names, it will fit with the first brisa. Says Gemara, my chazes the afchas bas brisa. Why do you switch the second brisa? Ifach hamaisa. Let's switch around the first brisa. Says Gemara, no, it is more plausible that the first brisa is more reliable. Why? Man shamas le omar. Who is the one that holds the opinion that kuli bayis kar ba'amis dami, that the entire home is considered has a status of 4 amas? It is Rav Shimon Elazar. We find elsewhere that Rav Shimon Elazar holds this type of opinion, this type of shita. So apparently, the first brisa is correct. The first brisa that attributes the concept of kuli bayis kar ba'amis to Rav Shimon Elazar, that is the precise version of the machlekes, and we must switch around the second brisa to be in line with the first brisa. So we have 3 shitas regarding meraglayim. We have the Tanakama who holds that regardless of where the meraglayim is, whether it's on this side or the other side of the bed, he must be marchik dal damis. We have a Shimon Gamliel that says if the meraglayim is on this side of the bed, he means to be marchik dal damis. If the meraglayim is on the other side, he may be kar miyad. We have a Shimon Elazar who maintains that the entire house is considered like dal damis and is prohibited from reciting Krishma in this home. And the last halacha is regarding tachas hamita. If the meraglayim is underneath the bed, that is permitted. The Gemara now will analyze this halacha. Continues the Gemara, Omer of Yosef, boy minei Rav Huna. I once asked the following question of Rav Huna. According to the shita of Rav Shimon Elazar that one may not recite Krishma if there is Meraglayim present anywhere within this bias, unless the Meraglayim is situated underneath the bed. So I asked him the following question: Mita pachas mishloisha pshita li'tilavadami. If the bed is very low, the bottom of the bed is within 3 tfachim to the floor. This is less than 3 tfachim, which is considered to be lavud. The concept of lavud will apply, which means lavud means an extension. We regard an area which is less than 3 tfachim as if it is closed up. So in this case, pshitali, it is, I'm certain, the lavadami, that is regarded as being closed up, and the meraglayim that is situated under this bed is considered to be out of the way. It is enveloped with the bed, it is covered up by the bed, and one may recite Krishma in this room. However, shloisha, if the bed is higher, it's 3 tfachim high, off the ground, or abba, chamisha, shisha, shiva, shmoina, tishama, what will be the halacha in that case? If the meraglayim is situated under the bed, which is a bit higher, is it considered to be enveloped in the bed? Or in that case, one may not recite Krishma near this meraglayim. Amar Leis, he said, Lo yadana, I don't know. Continues the Gemara, Asora vadi lo mibayli. Regarding a bed which is 10 tfachim high, that certainly I had no shaila, I had no question. Why? Amar Abaye shafar avdis lo yibaylach. It is good that you hadn't asked the question, you hadn't presented your shaila regarding a bed that is 10 tfachim high, because kol asara, if something is high 10 tfachim, rishus achriti, considered to be its own domain. It doesn't relate to the meraglayim that is situated underneath it. It can be considered to be enveloped in the bed since it is way high up. Indeed, the conclusion is if the bed is within 3 tfachim of the ground, it is laved, it's considered to be closed off, and the one is permitted to recite Krishma nearby. Asara, but if the bed is way up high, it is 10 tfachim high, rishus achriti, it is considered to be a separate domain, and one may not recite Krishma there when there's meraglayim underneath his bed. And again, this is all following the Shita of Rav Shimon Elazar. However, if it's between 3 and 10, this is a question which was not resolved. We follow the stringency of Rav Shimon Elazar, who considers the whole bias like 4 amis. The daughter, the son of the daughter of Shmuel, we don't follow his stringency. Continues the Gemara with the story. Rav Achoi, he made a match between his son and the daughter Bei Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marti. They brought him to the chuppah, and he wasn't successful in performing tashmish. He had difficulty. So Rav Acha went to investigate what is the source of his difficulty. He noticed the Sefer Torah lying there. So he exclaimed, Amar Lahu, Ichu Hashta, look now, here now. Ichu Hashta, here now. If I wouldn't have arrived, Sakantun Libri, you would have endangered my son. My son could have died, could have been punished on the account of him performing tashmish in the presence of a Sefer Torah. The Sanya, as we learned, Sefer Torah Tefillin, a house which contains the Sefer Torah Tefillin, Asla Shamash Boy Samita. One may not do tashmish Samita until he removes them, or he puts the Sefer Torah Tefillin in a Kli, in a double wrapping, a double covering. Amar Abaye Shanu. This that we said that a kli is sufficient. It's only if the kli is not designated to be used for the Sefer Torah Tefillin. But we're talking about a kli which was designated to be used for wrapping of this thing. Even 10 items, 10 vessel has the status of chad manadami, are considered to be one, meaning they're not considered to be 2 kalim, since they're all they're designated, they're subordinate to the Davar Shebekdusha, they all count as one. He needs another one. He needs to bring another kli, which is something unrelated to this Davar Shebekdusha, something which wasn't designated for the Kedusha, and wrap it above the other kalim. Amarava, glima kamatra. If one wraps his glima's cloak on top of the chest which contains the Davar Shebekdusha, this too is considered to be a kli b'zechli. The kamatra, the chest, is considered to be designated for the Davar Shebekdusha. However, since he puts his glima on top, now he has a double wrapping, and the chiddush here is, even if it's not wrapped all throughout, it's not wrapping the bottom as well, it's merely just over, it's wrapping the top and the sides, that is sufficient. It's considered to be kli b'zechli, which allows tashmish hamita.